So hello, my name is Marko. Today we're going to be talking about the state of tech enablement. Before we get started, I just want to give you a little bit of a background how this came about. So many years ago, 2018, a couple of us, me at the time, I was at Twitter. There was a gentleman by the name of Rajan from LinkedIn and Jenny Blackburn from Salesforce. We had this insight that there was a group of us who were dealing with technical learning and development, yet there was no community for us. So we set out to create a little group. It was called Tech Learning initially, and then we organized a conference in 2018 called TechnoCon, and initially we ran it annually at LinkedIn. And the following year we ran it at Twitter. So this photo was actually taken in 2019 in Twitter offices. And then pandemic hit, so we moved the conference online. But what it is, it's basically a group of essentially who's who of technical learning and development at the world's most innovative companies. We now get together once a month and share stories. As a matter of fact, Rajan is going to be talking about measuring effectiveness of learning and development at Splunk, starting later, I think next week or so. So tomorrow we can paste information about that for you. So what I've done in the state of tech enablement is basically compile various stories in such a way that it gives you an overview of what people in the industry are doing. So that's what we're going to talk about. So these are stories from the people from the community, as well as some of our customers that we had a chance to work with and have an insight into how they do things. So with that, what do we mean by tech enablement? So generally speaking, the promise is, how do you enable your technical folks to do their best work? So people, your talent that needs some kind of specialized knowledge, how do you get them up to speed and unlock them so that they can do the best work of their lives at your organization? And then there are different approaches to that. And we sort of put a whole bunch of things under the same umbrella that we've seen companies apply to this. So that includes onboarding, general knowledge sharing. There are different ways to do knowledge sharing. So there's documentation, peer collaborative learning, as well as one-on-ones and things that are a little bit more sort of ad hoc, such as mentorship, coaching, and office hours. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about metrics and insights. So how do you close the loop? How do you actually know things are working? So with that, so what is the challenge that we're solving? Well, what we see is when a company is small, things are great. Everyone sits around the same table or in the same office. Generally speaking, getting clued in how the organization works is ad hoc, and that is fine. That works just because everything is small, like I said. Now, as organizations scale, then what we notice is that there are silos of knowledge form, and that ultimately impedes the organizational speed and impedes its nimbleness. I remember when I was at Twitter, Dick Costolo, the CEO at the time, he basically told me, look, I want to build a nimble organization. So as we grow the company, he wanted the team to be nimble so they can reconfigure and adapt to whatever the challenges are. So as I said, as we scale, we run into the issue of this organizational drag. And so what I'll be doing throughout this presentation is I'll be sharing some stories from actual companies and actual people behind those efforts, those programs, just to kind of help illustrate this. So I mentioned Twitter, and I'll start with that. This is a place where I had the chance to work at. We built Twitter University there. And at the time, Alex Rudder was running engineering. So he was essentially responsible for half the company. And Twitter was growing quite rapidly. This is roughly pre-IPO, so about 1,000 engineers and doubling. And what he noticed is that as we were adding headcount, we were actually less efficient. So additional people were not adding to our effectiveness as a team. And so his insight was, well, we can add 200 engineers, essentially, 20%, or we can make everyone 20% more effective, right? And so it was actually easier to make existing team more effective than to just keep piling bodies into the organization. Not only more effective, but it was also created for a happier place to work. And so essentially that's what we did. So he ended up investing in a specialized team called Engineering Effectiveness. I worked on that team, and we built Twitter University, ran documentation, a whole bunch of other things within that. And it was one of the highest rated programs at the time at Twitter. So another example, another social media company, and also the one you would know is Facebook. Now, Facebook once upon a time was small. And so this story is set when Facebook was about 300 engineers. So Wayne Chang, pictured here, is one of the early engineering managers at Facebook. He actually also happens to be an investor in because he experienced this problem firsthand. So he observed that as they were growing super rapidly, they were starting to break things. And as you may or may not recall, Facebook used to have the motto, run fast and break things. But he wanted to break fewer things, right? It wasn't, at some point, it wasn't conducive to introduce a feature to millions or tens of millions of people only to have it not work properly. So what he discovered is that adding engineers lacked them being clued in. So they were already great engineers, they just didn't know how Facebook works and how to work at Facebook. So he invested in developing something called the Facebook's engineering bootcamp. And that turns out to be one of the still best rated boot camps in the industry. They did some really unique and interesting things, such as onboard people into engineering organization first before handing them to their specific hiring managers, in addition to having a very thorough 6+ week onboarding process, aka their boot camp, and so on. And by the way, one thing that this presentation has is a link to full story. So for each one of these that I'm talking about, there is a full story. Like I'll click here just to kind of give you an idea what that looks like. You'll be able to dive into that. And hopefully my internet is not too bad right now. I'm having some issues where I'm based out of. So that's the story of Facebook. I will be sharing the presentation afterwards, so you will get this back. So just kind of heads up on that. You'll have the links as well. Now, to talk about tech enablement, it may be useful to talk about the maturity index. So basically what maturity index is something that we developed to talk about how mature an organization is in terms of its enabling its people. And roughly, it's got these 5 levels. I'll walk through every single one of them separately, but in a nutshell, it starts with having very little to having a fully funded team. So let's look at this one by one. So level 1 is sink or swim. So basically, the organization doesn't have much. You come there and you essentially handed the laptop, maybe a way to log in, maybe they give you some paperwork and tell you, quote unquote, where the bathrooms are at. And that's essentially about what all it is. At some companies, we actually hear that everything is quote unquote fine because HR owns it. Well, HR owns a certain type of onboarding. They certainly own sort of culture and company onboarding and all the paperwork and stuff. But when it comes to technical onboarding, they may not be the best fitted for that job. So there's something there to consider. Now, this level of sink or swim is not just for small companies. This is to be expected at a startup, but we've seen it at some big ones as well. So WeWork, for example, we did a project for them when there were 800 engineers and doubling. And they still had very little technical onboarding whatsoever. GitHub, also a bigger company, the CTO there was essentially saying, hey, we have between HR and every hiring manager, onboarding is up to them. That's how it works. And so that was their level of maturity. At some point, the company starts scaling, and that lack of onboarding no longer works. And so what we notice is that usually somebody had enough and raises a hand and says, I'll do this as a part-time job. I'll do this in addition to everything else I have to do to do at the organization. And at Twitter, there was an engineer by name Ryan King. He launched Flight School. So that's kind of how he addressed Twitter's early concerns before we built Twitter University. I'll talk about Carbon Health later on. They had a very similar experience as well that followed that arc of maturing the organization. At some point, leadership notices that getting people clued in how to work properly at a place is important, and they usually fund it. And initially, they fund it by saying it's somebody's part-time job. And it usually ends up being somebody like a TPM, like a technical project manager or a program manager or even executive assistant. So somebody owns this, but it's not their full-time job. It's a sidekick thing. So we'll see some examples of that as well. And ultimately, as the company grows, as engineering or product development grows, it usually gets better funded, meaning that there's somebody committed to it, somebody owns the entire program, usually in a form of a technical university, and that's when it becomes a little bit more real. At usually bigger organizations, this goes beyond just a single individual into a fully funded team. So we're going to see some of those stories as we keep on going. Again, all of these stories are also linked, and you'll have the full transcript of the recording as well as the article with the highlights of each case study. So with that, let's talk about the building blocks. So let's say you are thinking about tech enablement, you're thinking about how to enable your folks to do their best work. What are the building blocks and how do you approach that and how do you go about that? So onboarding tends to be a low-hanging fruit, right? So even though you're hiring great people, getting them indoctrinated into your culture, how you work and how your place works, is something that is important, and it's uniquely yours, right? Every company is going to have a different way they work, and so we're going to look at some of the stories here of how various organizations have done it. So I'm going to start with Carbon Health, just because this was a very compressed timeline. It was a very rapid growth. So as pandemic hit, Carbon Health had to grow from 5 engineers. So remember, everything's fine when we're small, to 90 engineers. And they did this in 7 months. So it was a very, very rapid growth. And as you would imagine, just adding people was actually slowing them down at the exact time when they wanted to speed up. So it wasn't very productive for them initially. So one of the engineers, she stepped up and she basically said, I'm going to do something about this. Again, it wasn't her full-time job. So she did this on the side in addition to everything else. Eventually, she ended up hiring a program manager and then partnering with a program manager and then ultimately having a program manager fully owned it. So rapidly experienced the entire journey to TEMI, Tech Enablement Maturity Index. What was important for them is to lean onto documentation, as well as not neglect the human relationships, because it's very sensitive when a new hire is joining your team. It's not just about knowledge, it's a lot about tacit understanding of how the place works. And there's nothing like having the right human touch in those cases. And we'll talk about human touch as well. LinkedIn, on the other side of the spectrum, a bigger organization, they already had a bootcamp, and this is a story about how they reconfigured their bootcamp on the onset of pandemic. So pandemic hit, the offices got shut down. It seems like a distant history now, but at the time, it just hit everyone very fast and very hard. And the team that was running the onboarding basically had to move to a different model. Now, what they realized is that just moving on to online delivery was not as simple as taking something that's physically in their headquarters in Sunnyvale and putting it on Zoom. but they had to actually think about that a little more thoroughly. And so what they did is they, because their onboarding is based on the internal subject matter experts, aka the main engineers and architects and such, they partnered with them and they basically said, hey, what makes sense to move online and what makes sense to bottle into videos or articles or documents or some other self-paced content. So they basically divvied up what was in person into a blended experience where some parts were self-paced and some parts were still delivered virtually, but in online, live, so that you get that human touch, human connection with the actual people behind the curtains. So that was the step one. Step two was figuring out the right set of tooling, right? So how do you make this a simplified experience? How do you streamline all this? And we ended up working with them quite a bit on that. And then also getting the support from the leadership to have the funding and be able to do that. Now, what's remarkable is that they did all this in 3 days. So LinkedIn basically reconfigured their in-person to remote first experience in 3 days on the dime, essentially. And it worked out well, even first time around, and then they iterated from there on to kind of hone it in and perfect it. Uber, similar size, but slightly different concern. Uber also had to move everything online very rapidly. However, what's interesting about Uber is that while there's a lot of commonality worldwide, there's also a lot of localized concerns, right? So for example, Uber product in San Francisco differs than the one in Bangalore or the one in Sydney, right? So they have a lot of different concerns that are very localized geographically. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to create an onboarding program that celebrates both the mothership concerns as well as gives a lot of autonomy to the local concerns. So this is where they kind of iterated and worked with the localized teams so that something is controlled from Bay Area and the rest is given locally to individual offices to own. So this is their story and how they went about that. So that's a little bit about onboarding. Now, onboarding is just a part of technical enablement of your people. Once your people are up and running, so new hires are up and running, how do you socialize best practices? How do you get everyone to have the right understanding, have the right knowledge of how things work? So we call this peer or collaborative learning. And so the following section is going to be about some stories that we've seen or companies that we worked with to implement this. So with that, I'll start with Twitter University. As I mentioned, this is where I cut my teeth. My previous company was acquired by Twitter when they were growing rapidly, and they wanted to leapfrog maturing the technical enablement. So we came in to essentially deliver on that promise. Twitter engineering is where engineers get to do their best work, right? And so as we got in, we started talking to a lot of people, both new hires as well as old timers, both managers as well as architects and such. And we started asking them, what are the impediments? What's preventing you? What is blocking you from doing your best work? And we started identifying key systems, tools, processes that were poorly understood, right? And it was often there were some basic things, right? Like, for example, how do you stand up a service at Twitter? If you ask 5 most senior engineers, you get 5 different answers. So that obviously does not work. That's not going to allow us. If you have different understanding of how to do the same best practice, then we can't build a road to run fast on it. And so this was a big issue. And we wanted to go from being a small company where every team was in their own to being a company where we can run faster, and that required building a freeway with the guardrails and such, so that we are not crashing as we go faster. So we basically started creating a peer learning concept where we would knock at the doors of teams that had those poorly understood systems, and we basically partnered with them and said, hey, look, you have a huge support issues. right? Because you're answering all these emails and people are asking you questions, your internal customers, right? How do you leapfrog that? How do you make it easier on you and better experience on them, right? And so we would create workshops and classes with those teams and started teaching a lot of them. And so essentially by the time, within 2 years, we got from to a point where about 1 in 5 engineers was constantly teaching classes on things that they were the best in the world at. And so there was this rapid knowledge sharing that was happening, and it was truly generating a learning organization. And it felt like a company that's constantly growing and improving. So that worked really well, and it was that was basically where we learned about the magic of that peer learning concept. Now it turns out that we were not the only ones. So Spotify had a very similar insight in parallel. So we were not collaborating with one another at all at the time. We met Spotify through Technocon, and so at Spotify, the most senior engineers again spearheaded this this concept of, they call it collaborative learning, which is essentially the same as what we call peer learning. And what they were trying to do is unlock innovation. So their insight was innovation happens at the bottom, at like it's basically the engineers that are doing the work are the ones that have the insights of how to do things better. And they wanted to enable such insights to spread, to get socialized through the entire organization. So they basically leaned on collaborative learning, where anyone can easily, keyword easily, stand up a workshop or a class and essentially share their knowledge and create that culture of learning, and through that create a culture of autonomy and innovation and all this other good stuff. And so it was very much grassroots, and they spun it up, and it worked really well for them. And so again, this is their story, and I'll be sharing this document afterwards. Netflix is famous for their culture, and we've been working with Netflix initially with engineering, but then entire company. And in this particular case, I'm talking about Netflix Studios. So this is the part of the company that makes the actual content, so miniseries and TV shows and movies and stuff, Netflix originals. This is the part of the organization that is responsible for that. Now, it may not sound technical, it's not engineering per se, but the tool chain that Netflix uses to build miniseries is fairly complex. There are dozens of proprietary tools and such that they built to have that entire pipeline for content production. And pre-pandemic, they relied heavily on live learning. So essentially, you would go to Los Gatos, there was a lot of workshops and classes and tech talks and such, where you would learn how Netflix does things. And to them, this was important. Again, culture is important to Netflix. They're famous for that. So they wanted to indoctrinate people into the culture through their offices, through live, through personal connection and so on. And then pandemic hit. And as everyone else, it became sort of very enticing to just move everything online, right? People are working from homes, nobody's going to office. So why not just record everything and just give them content to watch, and they could do it whenever, middle of the night on their own from wherever they're at. And so while that sounds great on paper, in practice, they lost that human touch. They noticed that their culture started to erode, right? And so that was a big deal for them. So that was a wake-up call. And so then we worked with them on, like, how do we resolve that? How do we blend what's good about asynchronous self-paced learning, but also add the human connection? So they launched something called AMA sessions, Ask Me Anything, which was basically office hours, which is basically a way for you to knock at the door of the team whose product you're using, so internal to Netflix, and ask questions. And through that, build those connections, create that relatedness with the actual humans behind the tools that you're leveraging as a content producer. So that pendulum swinging slightly back turned out to be a very good workaround for them. So they basically got the best of both worlds: asynchronous content plus synchronous live human touch. So that's Netflix Studios example. So we talked about LinkedIn. So there are a couple of different stories, as a matter of fact, from LinkedIn. So this particular one was about unlocking engineers doing their work. So not onboarding. So now you are onboarded, you're working, you're doing your stuff. In the flow of work, you're stuck. And you're not sure what tool to use. So for example, maybe I'm spinning up a new service for LinkedIn product, and I have 3 different databases to choose from that are all internally built. Which one do I use? Do I use, the record store, or do I use relational database? Like, there are all these tools, but what and each one is individually documented. I just don't know which one to pick, right? Like, what's the right tool for the job? So I'm lacking this context. I'm lacking this tacit knowledge. And so the team behind Engineering University at LinkedIn wanted to enable, to unlock that, to basically help engineers figure out the right direction for the problem they were solving. And to do that, they wanted to put everything into a single place. So as opposed to beforehand having wiki for documentation and Google Calendar for live workshops and LinkedIn Learning for some e-learning content, they wanted to put everything under one umbrella. So we worked with them to basically create a centralized place where you can discover content, you can discover live learning sessions, you can discover live experts, so actual people that you can connect with, because it is 5,000 engineers, so it's a rather large population, and make everything super streamlined, super simple, ergonomic to their engineers. So in the flow of work, they can use learning to enable themselves to solve technical problems. And this is an example where we're not talking about learning and development for the sake of learning and development. We're not talking about it as a perk. We're talking about it as a way to unblock and enable key talent to do their best work. And so it's a very different purpose. And so the approach is also slightly different with tech enablement than traditional learning and development here. So that was a couple of stories on peer or collaborative learning. Next, I'm going to touch base on technical documentation. So documentation is always an important thing. We always hear about companies, especially the small companies, saying, well, we're going to solve this by having the culture of documentation. In other words, we're going to make sure our engineers document everything. And that works great initially, right? So a small company, you're starting from clean slate, you have nothing, and you start documenting things, and suddenly you have documentation, and life is good. Life is good for a couple of years for sure. And then what happens is you have too much documentation, right? So I'll give you an example. So I inherited the tech docs team at Twitter, and we had at the time the world's largest Confluence installation. We had something like 250,000 pages across 200 spaces. And it was just massive amount of docs. And so the problem wasn't that I wasn't finding a document when I typed something in a search. The problem was that I was finding 10 answers that were totally different from 10 very authoritative people, and I didn't know what to trust, right? So it was either out of date or contradicting or straight up like not relevant, not credible, and very little signal on which one to use. And so this over time did not work for us. So we ended up moving the documentation more towards being close to code. We built a system to handle that, so the documentation can be closer to code. Certain documentation, not all. Not everything makes sense to be associated with the code. But the ones that does, we could then do interesting things like measure drift, take care of ownership, etc. Simplify discovery and so on. So at TechnoCon, we actually hosted a panel, and we asked the same question from larger organizations, because this is where the problem starts becoming bigger. So we asked LinkedIn, Uber, Spotify, Splunk. Some of them are well known, respected for technical documentation efforts. And there's no silver bullet, but there are best practices, right? So acknowledging different types of documentation is one, right? Like, is it user guides? Is it API docs? Is it, cookbooks, getting started, project docs, et cetera, et cetera. So acknowledging the different types of docs have different shape, right? And then figuring out how to simplify where those docs live. So like I mentioned, project docs make sense to be closer to project itself, right? In a Git repo themselves. Certain other projects make sense to be in Confluence, but then how do you create relatedness between them, discovery and so on? Third is, how do you solve for ownership? Like, what is it? How do you manage? How do you know the doc is not out of date? 4, how do you measure drift? So if I have a document about a piece of code, but that piece of code has changed, can we automate that somehow to put a signal on a doc that the doc is now out of date by the virtue that what it's documenting has changed? So there's a lot of sort of things to consider. And so this is a panel that we hosted that these companies talk about their approaches. Again, everyone's having the same problems, and everyone kind of honed in on very similar best practices on how to go about that. So that was a quick segue into documentation. Now, one of the things that we also see emerging more and more when it comes to enabling people are this sort of ad hoc one-on-one or one-to-many interactions, right? So examples of that are mentorship, coaching, office hours, right? And we have a couple of examples of that. Like, for example, a couple of shapes of that, right? So for onboarding, we often see companies use a buddy system, right? Welcome to, my organization. I'll pair you up with an old-timer, right? So the old-timer is now responsible for your well-being and, getting you clued into how things work. Or maybe it's about more of a career mentorship, right? So you've been here for a while, you're a top performer. We want you to stay, we want you to grow, we want you to develop. So here is an official mentorship program. And here's how you can easily discover a mentor. And I'll talk about that. And that's becoming super popular, especially popular with the younger workforce, such as millennials, that are craving personal development and just basically bettering themselves. So they're seeking companies where they can be the better version of themselves. That's actually more important often than compensation and everything else. Then we'll also mention professional coaching. Sometimes I refer to this as situational coaching. So it's more of a, I'm working on something, I'm stuck, I need somebody to help me get unstuck right now. And sometimes that takes the shape of office hours. So with that, I'll give you a couple of examples of how organizations are doing that. So Airbnb is a good example of that. So Airbnb, we worked with on their peer learning for a while, and it was all nice and going well. And then they came up with this idea of like, if workshops and classes is something that we can have peers teach, and they certainly did, can we do that with mentorship? Can we have a mentorship program where anyone at Airbnb can be a mentor and can have a mentor? And so we developed a system with them where they would essentially run a class to onboard an employee into how to mentor. So basically, you would take a class to becoming certified as a mentor. Once you are a mentor, you can now open up mentorship sessions and be a mentor to others. And from top down, they had their leadership from Brian Chesky down say, this is something we believe in, we want to invest in, every executive should be a mentor, all their directs should be mentors, et cetera, et cetera. So within the first year, they got 10% of the population. So at the time, there were about 5,000 employees. So about 500 people became, quote unquote, certified mentors and had hundreds of sessions that they did. So there was a pretty big success even in the initial 12 months. And this was a story that they actually told at one of the early technical conferences when we used to meet live in person. So that was the story of Airbnb. Shopify did something different, but similar, and I see Andrew here, who at the time was at Shopify. I believe it started with Toby, the CEO. He had a personal executive coach, and it did wonders for him. And then Toby said, well, what if I brought coaching for my entire executive team? And that worked well. And then there was this insight, well, what if we opened up coaching for everyone? So every person at Shopify can have a coach. And to do that, they did a slightly different approach than Airbnb. They basically recruited professional coaches. So they built a team of about a dozen, I believe at the time, professional coaches, and stood up a program called Coach's Corner, where any employee could essentially go and discover availability and sign up for 30 minutes to an hour situational coaching session anytime they wanted. So that was their approach, slightly different, but again, democratized, so that coaching is not something that's limited to just the upper echelon of the organization. Now, Dropbox is taking notes from all this, and they did a talk where they laid out their coaching roadmap. So essentially, they're starting as a more traditional organization would, so upper echelon, so the C-suite gets coaching, but then they were sort of looking at the stories of Airbnb and Shopify and figuring out how do they roll that down so that eventually anyone at Dropbox can have that at their disposal as well. And so this is the story that they told, how they're thinking about this multi-year approach to that. So the story is still unfolding, and it's something that we're planning to do a follow-up session with them to kind of close the loop and tell how it all worked out over a longer arc of time. And finally, I wanted to mention Autodesk and what they did. In this particular case, it's not one-on-one. It's a small peer group of people coaching one another. So essentially, like every other company, Autodesk had a program to train their engineering managers. So they would basically take engineers and enable them to become managers. Now, getting somebody who's never managed to manage is rather daunting, right? Like you can give them the workshops and give them simulations and such. But when the rubber meets the road, when they're actually managing, how do they get support? How do they get help? How do they feel supported doing their changing essentially what they do as their job? And so Autodesk launched these forums, or small closed private groups. And when I say small, it's usually 7 ± 2. So it's basically a small group dynamics, and they would put new, freshly minted engineering managers into such pods or groups or forums, but they would also put somebody seasoned as a moderator. So there would be a seasoned EM, engineering manager, to help moderate such a forum and provide for that knowledge sharing, experience sharing within a group. So they basically leaned on a forum small group model to support their new engineering managers. And this worked really well. I've seen this play out also at Twitter, Uber, Lyft, and a couple other companies implemented similar approaches, and it's worked really well in this particular context as more of a experience sharing rather than knowledge sharing per se. So far we've been talking about internal knowledge and internal expertise, and usually this is the bulk of the challenge, because every company wants to has some internal magic, right? Like the culture that's very specific to itself, and it's usually about how do we unlock that knowledge sharing. That is the bigger problem for the most organizations than the vanilla content, right? Vanilla content, when I say vanilla content, I'm usually thinking about things you can buy off the shelf, everything from, LinkedIn Learning to Coursera's and, edX's of the world, where knowledge, where content is fantastic. It's out there, it's polished, you can just buy it off the shelf. So usually that's not the problem, but I wanted to kind of also mention external expertise and how that can complement internal experts' knowledge sharing as well. So we're going to look at two cases where they're the very different spectrums of scale. So Salesforce, it happens to be our first customer. So we started with Salesforce back in 2017, and Salesforce is more of an established company. So their technical stack tends to be stable. They use Java, they use technologies that we know they are well understood. There's not a lot of newly, freshly minted stuff at some point, right? And they recognize that, yet they still wanted to provide ongoing development to their technical folks. So they leaned heavily on vendors. So they basically went out and identified some key technical learning and training vendors and brought them in to augment internal knowledge sharing so that their catalog is much bigger, so that there's more to choose from, essentially. So regardless if you wanted to learn Java or machine learning or Android or Hadoop or big data, it was available to you because they seeded it with vendor provided technical content. So this is something they still do a ton of. It's working really well for them. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, Essence is a e-tailer out of Montreal, Canada. So they sell $800 t-shirts, for example, and they are much smaller. When we started working with them, there were 50 engineers, and they were shifting from a monolithic system to a microservice. So the initial problem was, how do we shift our existing people to think microservice architecture? So that was the initial problem. The second problem was, how do we, as a non-owned tiny company, startup, how do we build a brand so that we can attract the best talent in Montreal area? How do we retain and attract talent? So that was basically their secondary objective. And so anyway, they built Essence University. Their team is now 5x what it was. It's a huge Canadian success story. They recently did a talk on how they converted from a e-tailer to a tech-enabled company. Very powerful. So that's we haven't published that yet. It's coming up any week now, but the talk already happened. But this story is particularly about their incentives for people to go to conferences. So being in Montreal, so outside of Silicon Valley, where all the action is and so forth, they said, look, any of our engineers can go to any of the conference with one caveat. Whatever they learn, they have to come back and give a presentation on. And so essentially what happened was people started raising their hand and saying, yeah, we want to go to that conference in New York, Boston, San Francisco, etc. But they would come back with insights about new frameworks, new best practices, new technologies, and they would do internal tech talks on that. And that created this wealth of internal workshops and classes, and Essence University really flourished to that. And they ultimately became known as a great place to work because this is where you get to learn, you get to grow, you get to work with some really smart people. So that was their example of bringing external knowledge from conferences, but in particular in-house. So we talked about various things from onboarding to peer collaborative learning, documentation, coaching, mentorship, workshops, etc., etc. How do you know if it's working? How do you know how well it's working, right? And through which lens do you even measure this? So this is an age-old problem with no clear answer but a lot of best practices. And as a matter of fact, I mentioned that Rajan is going to be talking about how they measure success at Splunk. And so that's coming up as well. And he previously did this at LinkedIn. So lots of wealth of knowledge there. So look out for that, that talk on coming up to Technicon. But in the meantime, how do companies measure, or how do tech learning teams measure success? Well, there are different prisms to look at this through. So one of them is learning, and there's something called the Kirkpatrick scale. Some of you may or may not know that. I'll mention that in the next case study. Another one is, what does leadership think about your initiatives? And it's usually what they hear. It's usually the squeaky wheel or the grapevine. As much as leadership says that they tend to be data-driven, in my experience, it's usually story-driven. It's easier to digest for them. Onboarding, we usually hear people talking about 0 to competency, or 0 to productivity, or 0 to first or 10th commit, right? Like what do it take for you to get up to speed quickly? Culture is usually about attrition. Are we attracting and keeping our key talent? When I was at Twitter, I wondered how to measure my own success running Twitter University, and this is what the leadership told me. Like, they all measure us based on attrition, for example. Recruiting, like, what's our recruiting brand? Are we able to bring great people in? And are we known as a great place to work? And overall, it's a little bit of a black magic, how you measure success and how do you report up and sort of sell your program and justify your own existence. So let's look at a couple of examples. So on one side of the scale, we have Microsoft, and out of all the companies we see at Technicon, this is definitely the biggest. So Microsoft onboards 1,000 engineers per month. Okay, that's 1,000 engineers per month, right? So they're well over 100K engineers now. And they also measure everything, and they measure it across not one, but many different learning and development teams for the technical folks. And so this is a result of their poll. They have other reports that they presented at various talks we did with them. But this particular one is about barriers to learning, and essentially boils down to enable people to enable themselves to learn, essentially required a couple of things. One of them is time. So having enough time, so having slack in the system, having ability to take those learning opportunities, to take advantage of those learning opportunities, time to do that. Second one was resources. Like, is there a wealth of internal resources primarily, right? Are there enough workshops, classes, content, etc., that we can take advantage of? And the third one is, do I have a support of my managers, of my manager? Like, is it okay to do this? Is it culturally okay to learn? And so this was something that was obviously very important for them. So I think there was a question from Ari, how many of their employees leave after first month? I don't know their attrition rate. I think they keep a lot of people. I think it's known as a great place to work in general. So, but I don't have the details. And so one more story from LinkedIn. So LinkedIn, they obsessed over how to measure effectiveness specifically of their engineering onboarding, and they leaned on Kirkpatrick. I mentioned it earlier. So Kirkpatrick model has 4 parts. Part one is, did I learn or part one is, did I enjoy the learning opportunity? So like happy, sad face, or number of stars after a class, right? And that's relatively easy. You can just basically survey people right after, right? That's relatively easy. It doesn't mean a lot. It just means that they enjoy the experience, right? Now, level 2 is, did they learn what they're meant to learn? So if I was going through engineering onboarding, do I know how to do engineering now at LinkedIn? Can I demonstrate that, right? And so what they did here is they leaned on something called demo day. So they basically do a monthly demo day where people get to build stuff and showcase it, do a dog and pony show. And so this is how they leaned on to measure that level 2. Did you actually acquire the knowledge that you needed to acquire out of the learning? Level 3 was are you applying what you learned in your own work? So in other words, I could have taken a class on big data, but maybe I'm a mobile engineer and none of that applies to my job, right? So this is really like, what's the impact of that learning experience on your work? So that's basically a question there. And what they leaned on here is feedback. So they would survey 30 days out. So they would basically send you an email with a delay and say, hey, we know you took that class or attended that workshop. What's the impact of that on your day-to-day work? Like, are you applying that knowledge? Is it making your life easier at work? And then level 4 is, what's the impact of you having learned something on the business, right? So what they will do here is they will survey your manager 60 days out. So essentially, if somebody on my team went through, say, machine learning bootcamp, I would get an email and presumably I approve that because it's a significant investment of time as a manager. I would get an email saying, hey, Charlie on your team, did machine learning. Do you observe Charlie performing better with respect to machine learning? Like, what's the observation of you as a manager on the impact on the business from that? And so that was basically level 4. And it tends to be challenging. So as we kind of go further and further away from level 1, we more and more rely on qualitative versus quantitative feedback. So more stories, more anecdotal evidence rather than hard numbers when it comes to that. And that's natural because there's a lot more things at play. So it's not just learning, it's tooling, it's ability to apply knowledge, etc. that comes to play. So that's kind of how they measured their success. So I wanted to just kind of close the loop here on some general trends, what we're seeing across the industry as we talk to various companies. So first, the pandemic changed a lot how we work, and remote first, new way of working, back to office, hybrid work, all that is here to stay. And that basically threw a wrench into a lot of systems, or how we actually apply technical enablement at work. What we're seeing is a lot more blended approach. So it's a combination of certain things make sense to be single player, self-paced, but certain things make even more sense to be live, cohort based, do it with your teammates, get indoctrinated in the culture of the company and so on. And finally, one thing that we're seeing is tech enablement becoming strategic. And so a couple of months ago, we hosted Peloton, and we hosted them a talk from Peloton as they were slashing their workforce. So they had a really hard time post-pandemic, and they had a team that was technical learning at the time. And that team quickly changed their charter, changed their objective to tech enablement. So it was no longer learning for the sake of learning. It was now about enablement for the sake of enabling their engineers to be more effective with the team that they already have. And as such, they became strategic, so that VP of engineering at Peloton actually invested further in that team, versus what typically happens in recessions and such is learning and development is the first to get cut. So in this case, because they became tech enablement, they became strategic to engineering, and they actually got funding as opposed to being cut. So tech enablement we're seeing as something that is really emerging and becoming more and more important. So that's that. So with that, I wanted to close it. I know there were some questions. We kept a couple of minutes. Any other questions anybody wants to either post in chat, or we have a small group, just speak up as well before we close down.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi, I think earlier you mentioned something about a maturity index. What exactly is that?
Yeah, so I'll rewind here, and you might have missed it. So we came up. This is something we developed. Tech Enablement Maturity Index. Okay,
Oh,
Emmy.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
sorry.
In other words, yeah, it's just how what we're observing stages through which companies go as they turn toward enabling their people, right?
Yes.
From ignoring it to fully funding it.
Totally understand. Sorry, I misspoke. My question was more who actually uses this maturity index? Is this just something that you use, or do other companies also use this as well?
So tech enablement is fairly new as a category. So we came up with this to kind of talk about where people are on the scale, so this is just based on our observation of working with both smaller innovative companies and very large ones, and how they go through this experience. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
This is Andrew. I really like the Tech Enablement Maturity Index, and that resonates with me from what I saw, like even seeing Shopify scale 10x. And I'm just curious with, do you see other levels beyond number 5? Like I could see like some of the groups that you've worked with, they might be past that. Like they don't just have a well-funded team. They're like I'm thinking of like Splunk now or LinkedIn, where they're using data, or Microsoft, like measuring the learning culture. So would you anticipate maybe other levels getting added to kind of highlight the kind of the results of the well-funded team?
Yeah, totally. And just as an FYI, hey Andrew. Andrew is on the board of Technocon, and he's seen all this at Shopify play out from early on to 10xing it, as he mentioned. And you're absolutely right. There is beyond level 5. We are conducting a survey across the industry, so Tomomi is actually spearheading that. So we'll have a little bit more data to support that as well.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Good to see you too, Marko.
Yeah, great to see you. Thanks for joining. Yeah. So with that, I know we're at the top of the hour. I just wanted to say, if you want to get a hold of me, my contact info is just Marko++co, or easy to find. I will be following up with all of you and sending you a PDF with this presentation that has links to all the stories as we recorded them at Technocon, so that you can actually unpack any of these. I'm happy to chat further and also learn more about what you're working on. So that's kind of how this evolves. So yeah, thank you, and great to see everyone.